Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing the album Searching for the Lost Key by the band The Emerald Dawn.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Just as a quick side note to start this video off, if you do happen to know of this band, I'd love to know it. I'd really love to know whether you knew this band before getting into this video. So if you did know the Emerald Dawn, just go down to the comments, write something like, I knew Emerald Dawn or something like that, and I'll be really interested to know because to me these guys seem very much obscure. Anyway, this is it, and enjoy some of my favorite bits from this album. So when it comes down to it, I feel like I personally get to know a lot of progressive rock bands. Now yes, I know that I'm not making any sense. Why did I say no with the quotation marks? Well, basically what I mean by that is that despite being exposed to a lot of bands this year, it seems to me like after I see a band, I see what type of subgenre they play and a bit of backstory about them, I just kind of know what I'm gonna be listening to. I can mentally prepare myself, and of course we see this a lot with like the Canterbury scene. So I see a band from the Canterbury scene, I know that Dave Stewart is on it, and I know when the album came out, and I kind of know what to expect already. Or with Italian prog, same goes, you just kind of know what to expect. But when it comes to today's album and today's band, I saw their name, I saw the genre they were playing, I saw what instruments they had, and I couldn't really tell myself what I thought this album was going to sound like, thus I really didn't know anything about this one. So basically coming in blindly for this band today, I asked myself one single question. Who are Emerald Dawn? And well, the answer to it is as follows, I guess. The Emerald Dawn formed in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, back in 2010 by two people. The first one is of course Katrina Stewart, also known as Tree. She is a multi-instrumentalist and well, she was one of the original founders of this band. And the second founder is yet another multi-instrumentalist as well from Edinburgh called Alan Carter, and together these two guys formed the Emerald Dawn that year. And together the two moved to the south of England to St. Ives, and together they met drummer Thomas Jackson, and the three of them basically compiled the initial lineup of the Emerald Dawn. Now when it comes to the name of the band, this is pretty interesting, and it also ties a bit to the name or the nickname Tree that Katrina Stewart goes by basically, and that's the fact that this band is very much ideologically active and sort of has their music revolving around the environment, ecological change, and basically securing ourselves a greener future. And well, if you still didn't notice how this all ties up with the name of the band, I think that it's pretty lovely. The idea of an Emerald Dawn basically means that something off somewhere in the horizon is green and it's just lingering over and it's about to rise. And well, if we as a society and as humanity go ahead and let that sunrise happen, we will see ourselves in a green future when we and our planet will both have a good state of existence. Now to be honest, when I went ahead and checked out things from this band, I searched them up on YouTube and I immediately saw how they looked like, and let me tell you, these guys are pretty hippie. I was not that surprised to see that that was how they looked like. Of course we have Tree with her long beautiful dreadlocks, which I personally love. If you didn't know, I used to sport dreadlocks for 4 years, so yeah, I really like that style. And of course we have all the rest, and they dress up in like these green clothing to basically symbolize the emerald idea in their live shows, and I think it's pretty cool, and I like the fact that they have a consistency and a motif to all their ideas in their music. Now, the band themselves have reflected upon themselves as being a symphonic prog group, but when you go on the prog archives, you'd see that their classification was actually chosen to be neo-prog, and for what it's worth, I think I agree with that. Now, as I said, as the band began, they only had 3 members, and despite having 2 multi-instrumentalists and a drummer, none of them were actually the main bassist for the band, so they didn't go for the ELP/triumvirate lineup of a keyboardist, drummer, and a bassist. Instead, they went forth with the keyboards mainly, guitar, other instruments, and drums. So on their debut album, it is pretty apparent that the bass is not a mainstay instrument. It does come up a few times, but only, I would guess, when someone just doesn't have anything else to play at that moment. And yes, this actually brings me on to my next point. When you listen to these guys' music, at least on their debut album, it is quickly apparent that these guys play music that is easily and of course viably able to be recreated on an on-stage live performance, and I like that idea. I like the idea that they don't do some stuff in the studio and then everything that they perform live just sounds like a very stripped down version of it, so I guess that's a nice ethic to go on. And well, since forming in 2010, these guys have basically been writing their music and touring around Britain for about 4 years, and after a long 4 years of doing so, finally on the 8th of October 2014, these guys came out with their debut album, which is the one we're reviewing today, called Searching for the Lost Key. And well, this one does have a lot of connection with its cover, but of course I'm jumping myself a bit, so let's get back to it later. Now, just to quickly recap this entire story and continue it onwards, these guys, after releasing their debut album, have probably realized that they did need a bassist among their ranks, so they brought forth a bassist called JJ Quick, which is a pretty interesting name, and they played with them on their next album that came out in 2017 called Visions. Now, Quick would actually be replaced afterwards with yet another bassist that actually has a name that fits much more into the whole idea of the band, called David Greenway. And with Greenway, they would create yet another album in 2019 called Nocturne, and then they would follow it up yet again in 2021 with an album called To Touch the Sky. Now, the interesting thing in this 4-album discography is that when you look on the prog archives, you can definitely tell that their first 3 albums are pretty moderate to good. In some ways they have pretty much the same rating scores, and they are not that well known. But when it comes down to their latest album, for some unknown reason I guess, this one got more attention and more positive ratings, almost sporting a rating of 4. And well, looking up their name on YouTube, you can definitely see that these guys are still going around performing their music, and as it seems right now, they're not really going to stop anytime soon, so I would guess to be pretty safe to assume that these guys would come out with another album sometimes in the near future. Now, when it comes down to the music of this band, I do feel like the definition of neo-prog is pretty close to accurate, but not quite there. And well, at first it kind of baffled me. What was I listening to? Why couldn't I really think of this as neo-prog? Why was I so confused? And then I came up with this definition, which I personally have never heard being used, and that's a sort of neo-psych. Now, when I say neo-psych, I basically mean what you think. Take psych rock, take neo-prog, put them together, find the perfect balance within them, and you're gonna get what you're listening to on this album. But you see, the thing is, I was not really a big fan of this album, and when it comes to mediocrity, I do think that this is one of the more mediocre albums that I've listened to this year. Yes, it does have some redeeming qualities. One of them, of course, is being able to just swoop you away on the monotonous music that it will hold within itself but in a different sense, yes, it is just very monotonous most of the time, and certainly not something that I listen to with much awe. But the thing is, despite just being pretty average most of the time, this album can actually get somewhat bad, okay? The fact is, when someone says that they're a multi-instrumentalist, the first image that pops into my mind, is basically every single member from Gentle Giant, and that's a pretty high bar to just put out there. But no, in this case, I do feel like the main two multi-instrumentalists on here, being Tree and Alan Carter, are just kind of good at their own respective instruments, but not really that amazing at all the rest. So of course Carter, you just have him on the guitar, and he's a pretty proficient player to say the least, and seeing him play live, well, it can definitely show. And we have Tree on the keyboards, and honestly, if I have to say, I think that she's good, but she's not really showing any strong capabilities or virtuosyncratic tendencies at her craft. She just kind of does whatever, and I guess that's fine. But then you get to certain parts, like when she plays the flute on the third track, which I think is called like Shadow and Light or something like that, and that is pretty bad, okay? I have to say this, it's not a good flute solo. It was actually something that I would have really paid to give up listening to on this album. Okay, maybe it's not that bad, I'm just thinking that it was really obvious that that part was like of a lower quality than the rest of the album. Now, speaking of this entire album, it actually only has 4 tracks on it, and the total runtime of this one is about 44 minutes, so you'd say that like an average runtime of each song is about 11 minutes. And well, I have to say that these ones draw themselves pretty long, to the point of needlessly existing. Now, what I mean by that is that normally when I say that songs are too long, I mean to say that if you just shorten them to some extent, they would actually be much better. But I do find that most, if not almost all, the tracks on this album could have just simply not existed, and I would have been perfectly fine with that. I think that the only track on this album which really does have a justification for existing has to be the opener track called Beyond the Wall, which to me was a pretty fine track and would be my favorite from the album, but really not by a long margin than the rest. And honestly, to conclude and to be perfectly honest with you, I was pretty content with this album. I don't think that it's a bad album in any way, but just objectivity had to prevail to some extent, and seeing as this album is really mediocre and average, I kinda just had to look at it in that sort of light. But when it comes down to it, this band seems to be heading in a pretty promising direction, and I don't think that this is the last time I'll hear of them, but maybe I won't be that anxious to coming back to their music anytime soon. So this album cover is both lovely and also uncovered some sort of a hidden phobia that I have. Apparently, I think it's some sort of derivative of claustrophobia, but I really don't know what it is. Now, this lovely painting was actually painted by no other than Tree herself, and I do have to say that it looks quite nice. It of course ties back to the name of this album being Searching for the Lost Key, so we have this keyhole that is engraved inside of this emerald gemstone, and through it we are actually able to see this sort of lovely creek, and beyond it we have a quiet forest, which to me looks like something that represents a light at the end of a tunnel. Now, this whole idea of seeing something at the end of the tunnel really does come back to the whole idea of the emerald dawn. A dawn is something that you see off in the distance, like something that you're longing for. And this idea of seeing something that you're longing for just in a hand's reach away off in the distance, but there's something that's disallowing you from getting there, is pretty nice. But it gets even nicer when you suddenly start realizing that this motif was persisting and still will probably persist in the rest of the band's album covers, of course all made by Tree herself. So I'm just scrolling them over here on the side, and you can definitely see that they all share the same sort of aesthetic of that light at the end of the tunnel. So while this album cover might be one that I subjectively am not the biggest fan of in a way, I do believe that it actually looks pretty nice. And when it comes down to it, it has generated what is probably my greenest thumbnail to date, so I have to say that it's pretty special for that regard. But unfortunately, when it comes down to it, this album is pretty underwhelming, and for that it's gonna get a rating of 5 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Knee Frame, of course by the band Koenji Hayake. One final time, these guys. Yes, I'm so excited for them. But yeah, I'd love to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. It's never too late. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.